Hey, glory to Jesus Christ, glory forever. This is Father Anthony from Hartwell, Georgia. And today something a little different. So I'm going to present a paper that I gave at the conference formerly known as the Sophia Institute Conference at Union Theological. I did that last week. It's a wonderful conference, and what they do is they create a culture that welcomes people who really aren't full-time scholars, but put them in the same mix with big-time scholars, right? So there's, some mentoring going on. There's some encouragement, certainly, very different culture than the kinds of conferences that I've presented at as a political scientist, where it's pretty much adversarial. At least it used to be. So when I was trying to figure out if I still had the chops to do academia, I presented a paper at this conference a few years ago, and it went well. And so it's their fault that I'm back doing this, at least part-time. So anyways, the paper that I'm going to present to you is Pluralism, Polarization, and Discernment: The Challenge and Promise of Diversity. And if you have been following my work at all, it sounds so grand, my work, then you're familiar with this theme. The theme of discernment runs, pretty constant in all my work, because it's problematic. And at the very least, the fact that it's problematic needs to be on our radar. I'm reminded of this at least every time I prepare for communion, because we have that wonderful psalm verse as part of our preparation. I said in my amazement, every person is a liar, right? So there's a meditation from David on this existential state of our relationship to truth. So the context for this work is not just that lack of discernment, discernment, how hard it is for us to know objectivity, but also the increasing political polarization in our culture. And that's something that I've been studying as a PhD student at the University of Georgia. It's important enough that they actually offer classes on it. And, the fact of the matter is that we are, the people of the United States, that is, becoming increasingly polarized. And mostly it's by ideological camp, right? And this commitment to a communal ideology, and it's what's referred to by many moral psychologists as tribal. So when I use the word tribal, I'm not using it in any kind of, weird anthropological sense. It's in the psychological, sociological sense that tribal, these divisions, these visceral divisions, us versus them. And for us, the primary one growing in the United States is liberal, conservative, left, right. And the challenge is that the resulting personal identity makes this the primary way of seeing the world, at the expense of all the other ways of seeing the world that would allow for compromise and bridge building, right? So within society, there are all kinds of potential cleavages, is what we call them in political science, all kinds of things that could divide us. And in a place like America, those don't reinforce each other all that much. They cross-cut. In places where there are no cross-cutting cleavages, it's very difficult to find compromise and to get groups to work together. And for a long time, Northern Ireland was given as a great example of that, right? Because if you knew someone's religion, you also knew their economic status, you knew their attitude towards the center, you knew all kinds of things, right? Here, the closest that we have to that for a long time has been the divide between blacks and whites, right? And it is the case oftentimes when you see a black person that you have a good idea of economic status, you have a good idea of religion, and it's different than yours, right? This is the challenge. So, but in America, even with that one, there are all kinds of cross-cutting cleavages that we could mobilize to allow for compromise and just basic friendship, basic understanding, these building of bridges that make humanity and being human enjoyable. But what has happened increasingly is this single ideology has come to define the identity in a way that all of those other potential, cleavages, all the other parts of our identity just disappear. And this has been found through surveys, certainly. So that tribal identity becomes the primary way of seeing the world. And what results from that is the demonization of the enemy and the justification of the self and one's tribe becomes the default mode of analysis. That's how we do the math, is reinforcing that. And it's made more acute in our modern day because social media, right? Social media does not provide the empathetic cues and reinforcers, right, that we have in regular conversation. And then you have the availability of confirmation bias, and it's set up for this. And there's so much work that's been done showing that our media is set up just to stoke our divisions. That's its money-making method, right? So we're in a tough time. And over this past year, you put that, on top of that, you add COVID and this divisive election season. And it's compounded by all the things that come with that, this fear, this anger, this isolation. So the opportunities for demonization of the other and justification of the self just increase, and it's a mess. So political polarization may seem normal, right? The fact is, you could say, we've always had people on the left and people on the right, and they've never been particularly charitable. Okay, fine, but it's been getting worse. Listen to me, it's getting worse. If it feels like it's getting more nasty, that's because it is, right? Now, I study politics and I study political culture, but I do it as a social scientist, and I also do it as a pastor and theologian. So for the purpose of this paper and this presentation, I'm less interested about how polarization affects our politics, not all that interested in policy, right, than what it is doing to our science and to our life in Christ. Specifically, I'm interested in how it affects our scientific and spiritual discernment. And here, in case you're at the limit of listening to a dull academic talk, let me tell you the argument that I'm going to make over the next 10, 20 minutes. So recognizing that discernment is problematic, both science and Orthodox Christianity provide individual and social methods to improve objectivity. Both of these work best when diversity is celebrated, and they break down when it's not. Polarization is blinding us and hampering our ability to live and serve well. So what is this method? Well, you're familiar with the scientific method, at least we used to study it in school, right? And the first part of the method, the part that you were given a test on, first we want to look at the world, then we're going to develop hypotheses. And then we come up with hypotheses with things that you can actually measure, and then we do, ideally, a double-blind experiment if we're talking about humans, or we'd set up some kind of objective experiment if we're looking at nature. If you don't have that, you just collect a lot of observations and use statistics, or in my field, you're just very intentional about the way you leverage variation, right? But this is the individual part of the process. And that emphasis on hypothesis generation, rather just throwing ideas out, things that can be measured, and then to measure them objectively and to collect useful samples of data. All this is, it takes the ego out of the process. So the argument is that your ego, your preferences, your identity, your tribe, all this kind of stuff, it affects the questions you're interested in, right? And it affects the way you look at the world. But once you go into that method, it's data collection, and it then becomes more about the math, right? The second part of the scientific process then comes in and it helps correct for the kind of individual biases that did work their way in, okay? And it helps to cover the blind spots that no matter how well you followed the method, that you'll still have, right? And the second part is things like peer review, it's revisions, it's publishing. It's what I'm doing now. I'm putting these ideas out here, and I know that I'll get responses, I'll get criticisms that'll help make my work better, right? And then what happens once you put that work out there is it's put up for scrutiny, and people try to retest it and figure out if it works, and they tweak it a little bit, or it gets rejected. Sometimes it just gets rejected just because it's just not good. So that's the process. And here's the thing. So this has brought incredible progress, right? When you read someone like Pinker, right, and he presents, he says, look, we're heading in the right direction. Look how much better we're doing than we were 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Look at this progress, how we're bringing people out of poverty, how all these indicators are that the world is becoming a better place, right? And he's right. And it's because of our willingness to subject our ideas to this kind of scrutiny, right? So we get scientific progress, so to speak. But it's not immune from our biases. It's not immune from individual biases. It's not immune from collective biases. Now, individual biases can affect outcomes in ways that are both subtle and severe, right? But when the community is functioning properly, both those kinds of mistakes, both the subtle ones and the more severe ones, are identified, right? And they're challenged, if not corrected. But here's what happens in a polarized society. In a polarized society, the severe ones are more likely to be given a pass. The blind spots are shared within the community, right? And the subtle ones won't even be noticed, especially if they reflect the bias of the powerful in the community. Now, some of the examples of this are falsifications of data. There's p-hacking, right? You can Google that if you've never heard of it. That's an example of a severe problem. But there are less severe ones, right, that become by their nature controversial. And if you'd like, later on, we've got Deacon Timothy Kelleher, deacon and theologian Deacon Timothy Kelleher, waiting in the green room listening to this, and he's going to offer comments and responses. And if you'd like, I can follow up with some examples that are controversial. But I offer them now. I will polarize people and they won't listen to the rest of the talk. So, how about the orthodox method, right? Well, it's the same problem. You face the same problem when you're trying to do science as you do when you're trying to do philosophy or theology, right? Is that we have a problem of discernment. So, of course, the church, Christ, God knows, they know our situation. And so they've given us a process for working through this. And the Orthodox method, I'm going to divide it into two parts to parallel that scientific method. And the individual part is orthopraxis, right? These things we do as individuals, as individual Christians. And then the second part is ecclesiology. So the first part of this process, it maximizes our potential for individual objectivity. And you know the process, right? You just haven't heard it put in this context, right? But things like humility, the mother of all virtues, right? Humility, continual repentance, the psalmody, the repetition of the prayers, the perfect prayers the church has given us, the time spent in quiet meditation, hesychasm. There's the immersion in worship. There's a sacramental life. There's study. There's service to others. All these are designed to get to allow us to see things in the light of Christ, we say, right? Rather than through the lens of our own ego, right? And then the second part of the process, so that's orthopraxis, all the stuff that we do, the fasting we're doing right now, the patience when the birds are being so loud when you're trying to give a talk All these things get us out of our own way. And then the second part, what I'm calling ecclesiology, this isn't just submitting your stuff to your bishop or your priest, even though, you should give all your stuff to me because I'm the smartest person in the world, and I'll tell you how you're doing. No, that's not what I'm talking about. It's what you can call it the mind of the church, whatever it is, you're submitting your work to the body of Christ, right? And this corrects individual biases and mark missing, right? You see what I did there? And you're in constant conversation with and submission to the ecclesia. And again, this is when we talk ecclesiology, usually we're just talking, oh, well, you've got bishops, you've got priests, you've got deacons, you've got minor clergy, and then you got your laity. No, I mean, I'm talking about the church. those are part of it, right? But, we also have the priesthood of believers. We've got patristic literature and all this. And we have to be in continual conversation. But even there, even though we've been given this process, this Orthodox method is not immune from individual and, dare I say it, collective biases. And as with the scientific method, individual biases can affect outcomes, the things that we come up with, in ways that are subtle and severe. When the community is functioning properly, when the church is healthy, both of these are identified and challenged, if not corrected. We have a process for this, right? But as with the scientific community, when our Christian community is dominated by one side in a polarized culture or subculture, the severe problems are more likely to be given a pass, and the small ones are unlikely even to be noticed, especially if they reflect the bias of the powerful in the community. It's the same problem because we're the same humanity. Now, let me give you a brief digression on the role of virtue, right? So when I was an intelligence analyst, we had the same problem of discernment, even though we had billions of dollars spent to give us all kinds of data about what was going on, for instance, in Afghanistan. It was very difficult for us to actually know. And part of it was the way we're wired. And so what I would teach analysts is that you should have confidence. You are the subject matter expert. You're the one that's immersed in the data. But it has to be a confidence that is balanced by humility. It has to be a confident humility or a humble confidence, right? And boy, I was so happy when I started studying theology, and Professor Butinov at St. Vlad's wrote a book called Sweeter Than Honey, where he talked about this very same thing and how within the context of dogma, right? And about the need to hold our own opinions, even about dogma, light enough to allow for us to be corrected and to hear others as something other than a threat. And in our pride, we'll hear it as a threat to orthodoxy, but it's really just a threat to our own ego. Orthodoxy is fine. Right? And Peter does just such a great job about writing on this. And if you meet him, he exemplifies it. So brilliant man, well-grounded in prayer, certainly well-grounded in the patristic mind, but also willing to listen. Remember, our self-worth is not tied to our findings, our expectations, or our opinions. And we have to continually be aware of our reactions to criticism, our reaction to praise. We have to have this transcendent introspection, right? Especially in these times when, listen, we are increasingly identity-driven. We are increasingly tribal. That means that we've got to put that on our radar. Is my reaction valid, or is it just being driven by this worldly thing? Right? So, remember, I'm going to just throw two pieces of theology that I'm going to get back to social science, right? God desires that all be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. That's one of these pieces of data that we have. I'm going to put it together with another one. No one is saved alone, and no one comes to that knowledge alone. Even revelation, especially revelation, needs to be tested. We have to submit ourselves to the ecclesia, and that ecclesia must be open to the diversity of the experience, the voices, the learning, the grace offered by all of its members. So how do we teach this? How are we doing? When you look at your seminary experience or your university experience, your parish experience, your social media experience with other Christians, other even Orthodox Christians, how are we doing in modeling this virtue, in teaching this virtue? How are we doing in doing it ourselves? It's a rhetorical question. I know how we're doing. So here's some examples, right? And this is where people start to get offended. So one, and I took out the more controversial ones. So for science, can you have a rational conversation about the risk of COVID and the best reaction to it? Both the reaction of community and the best reaction of policy? Have you tried? No, because this process, the individual and the communal process, is broken. How about a spiritual question? The communion spoon. How'd that go? Was there conversation about this? There were certainly two sides. Did they listen to each other? Did they benefit from the witness of the other? Or was it just an opportunity to sharpen swords? I know what I saw. I know how I experienced that. I mean, have you had conversations about these things with people who are part of a polarized tribe? Was it a fruitful conversation? Was love accomplished? Was the experience of God realized? Was truth served? So when I bring these up, because you've experienced them, I hope you have strong opinions on them, right? But how much of the force of our opinion on these things, and especially of our affective commitment, our emotional commitment to those things, is identity-driven rather than fact-driven? And yes, I know you can point me to citations on the internet and of the fathers. All that does is show how easy it is to be tribal in today's culture. We have to intentionally develop relations of respect with people who think differently than us. We have to learn to listen. Now here's why I think these are good examples. These two, COVID response, and the communion spoon, demonstrate how difficult it is to trust, hear, and learn from the opinions of others. How do we feel about people who have different opinions about lockdowns, about mandatory public mask use, right? Why? What are they really saying? How do we feel about people who have different opinions about the communion spoon? Why? Is there a charitable explanation for their belief? Yes, they're nice, but they're stupid is not charitable, by the way. Let me give you two examples of how this progress works, and both are kind of ongoing. So one of the things that I study as a political scientist is what I call structural discrimination, right? How long has structural discrimination remained under the radar, right? How long was it part of what people who study culture call the third realm of power, right? This hegemony of thought. It just wasn't, again, it wasn't on the radar. It was if you were experiencing it, I'm sure. But for most of the culture, no. And then it moved to the second realm of contention where it was noticed, but it wasn't on the agenda, right? And it moved through that into right now, it's actively on the agenda. How are we going to address this, right? Now, it's ongoing, and I also believe that the way that discussion worked within academia is another demonstration of what happens when you have a polarized culture with a very dominant worldview, right? Where ideas were not, it's one of the more subtle ideas that wasn't challenged, even though it's very problematic. And that's the very concept of structural racism. And when that gets back to my department, that can get me canceled, right? But hear me, there is structural discrimination. But what we've done over the last 20, 30 years is we've changed the definition of racism from being an affect and an opinion about the worthiness of another race in relationship to one's own, to something that can be held by institutions. Something that can be held by institutions is not affective, it is discriminatory. And if there had been a balance in academia, that would have been part of the discussion. Now what we get is we get this full-formed idea being offered to the world from academia, and with the very good idea, right, we heard it, Black Lives Matter, yes, of course, right? But then we noticed all this other stuff came in too. And that's because it was fully formed. It wasn't part of a conversation within academia. It was brought out without the kind of discernment process of scrutiny that it should have been. My opinion, I could be wrong. So, how about a spiritual example? Let me give you a spiritual example of one that's in process, but is to me an obvious example of what happens when all voices aren't allowed to speak, and then what happens when those voices begin to be heard. How many centuries did it take for us to take a hard look at the misogyny, yes, misogyny, that had worked its way into our rituals of initiation? And I'm relying on the work of Carrie Frost. If you're not familiar with that work, so those prayers point to there's a need to, when you bring someone back into church, there's a need for forgiveness, right? Remission of sin. And the way that sin is framed by many of the prayers in the Book of Needs, is the prayer of ritual impurity, right? There's sinfulness associated with childbirth. And that it's not good theology, right? And so, there's been a movement to provide alternate prayers. How many centuries did women hear those prayers? And maybe responded, but their voices weren't heard. But now they are. And it's part of a conversation about what those prayers used to look like before misogyny came in. What was the original intent? What is our understanding of ritual purity? It becomes a conversation. It's not an agenda, it's a conversation. And then the church responds in love with discernment. And the Antiochian Church has a new prayer book for this, Services of Initiation. It includes alternate texts that are from the older tradition, right? So, anyways, that's why that's an example of what happens when the diversity of voices are not empowered, not listened to, and then what can happen when they are. So a summary of my argument is that polarization keeps us from seeing things well. We need inner peace in order to see objectively, but we're not so good at that. We need to listen to people who disagree with us in order to see objectively, but we're not real good at that either. It's so important that within the community that I came from, the intelligence community, you would actually create that position of adversary, right? Man, it's so important. It was like on the Divine Council too. You have this position of adversary that forces you, the red teaming, we called it, where you would have a contrarian to just point out the problems in your argument, right? And they weren't always right, but they kept you on your toes. They kept you honest. The cultivating diverse faculties within the university is part of this, right? And faculties have benefited from minority voices, and faculties are being hurt by the lack of religious and conservative and libertarian voices on faculties, right? They just are. And that's not just, I'm not just saying that because I'll be on the job market as a religious libertarian, right? And then there's the example of what happens when you support lay theologians and when you support pan-orthodoxy. Pan-orthodoxy is an easier one to sell to most people. How much are we being hurt from the fact that the ROCOR is not part of our American Orthodoxy right now? That they've pulled themselves back out as they used to, right? How much did we miss their voice through much of the 20th century, right? How much did they miss the witness of the rest of world orthodoxy? We need each other, right? Other people, whether they're other churches, other cultures, they operate along a different dimension than we do. But we can only see and benefit from that, from their wisdom that they gain from that, if we can hear them as they are. So we listen to learn rather than listen to justify ourselves and to argue with them. And Father John McGuckin, he gave a wonderful talk. He was the keynote speaker at the conference. And it was wonderful and very erudite, you know, because it's Father John, right? But my summary of it is, you know, man, some people really are stupid, and we got to call them out on it. And the fact is, yes, that was part of his talk. Yes, some people are stupid, and ignorance is a problem. But in our tribalism, in our polarized culture, we overdiagnose stupidity and ignorance, right? Here's the thing for me, why it's on my radar, why this is a big part of my work. It's because polarization keeps us from living the unity and the love that we're called to live. Discernment is part of that. Within Orthodoxy, here are some things that make it even more difficult for us to overcome the polarization that's worked its way into the church. We have dogma. We have dogma as a category. It's a good category. It's a necessary category. It's ontological. And it's a necessary process for determining what is true. You know, we're the Church of the Councils, right? And heresy is a real thing. But we can misapply this. Just because a hammer is great for running in nails doesn't mean it's good for cleaning your windows, right? We can misapply this necessary process, and I think that we do it. You know, we use that muscle memory. We also have another thing that I believe is blessed, but it's still problematic when it comes to discernment. Our all-male priesthood and our strong monastic witness are both blessings, but they bring biases that we have to be open about and that we have to work to mitigate, right? They aren't meant to be the defining hegemony. They're meant to be the leading part in a conversation. For conservatives, in the church, black and white thinking, right? That comes along with many conservatives, right? It can be correlated and with increased deference to authority among the laity, right? So things just line up and you get, you know, kind of cultish parishes. And then that kind of culture will also create and attract authoritarian personalities. And so you just get a lining up of this, and there's not only not a desire to listen to the other voices in the church, there's protection against it. So for conservatives, the recognition that some things really are gray, right? And clergy can be wrong. For liberals within the church, there has to be the recognition that tolerance and openness really can lead to accepting things that are harmful, things that are sinful, things that are heretical. So there has to be a continual willingness to listen to the voice of the conservative. Right? All right, when liberals and conservatives are polarized, as they are now, they become caricatures of themselves. They're meant to be together in the church, informing, loving, holding each other accountable. They need each other. Harmony is a feature of the pattern. So differences in constitution, differences in orientation, to include, we've talked about risk aversion, right, when it comes to COVID. The fact that we have different profiles towards risk is built in. It's blessed. It's supposed to make for a meaningful and a more useful conversation. It's part of the design. And I would include liberal, conservative, and libertarian, you know, with the attitude towards egalitarianism, towards order, and towards freedom, right? Those are part of our constitutions that we bring to the table. When differently constituted and oriented people work together, they keep each other honest at the very least, because it's so much easier to see the flaws in the logic of people who think differently than you, right? So at the very least, if I, as someone who's wired to think in terms of freedom, am sitting at a table with someone who's wired to think in terms of equality or egalitarianism or order, they're going to challenge me. They're going to say, yeah, that's great for freedom, but look what it does to our communities. Okay, good. So we have a conversation so we can develop better policies. At the next level, they complement each other because they're bringing different gifts, right? So we bring a unique pastoral witness to the other, right? So we've talked in these podcasts and in my writing on For Good Guys Wear Black, how you should have as part of your spiritual advising team people who think differently than you. So if you're wired more as a liberal, then have some conservative people that you go to for advice and to hold you accountable. They will pastor you if they love you in a beautiful way that you don't expect, right? And then together, because this is part of God's plan, you know, that differences are brought into unity, into a harmony. It takes the whole enterprise to a new level. We do church, we do love well. This ontology of unity and plurality is part of the plan for redeeming the world, for making the crooked way straight. We are growing, we are meant to grow, a new humanity in the Logos, right? In the pattern, where differences no longer divide, but provide blessings and an increase in understanding and more opportunities to love. We are to live in the time of Pentecost, not in the time of Babel. So here I've got, and I'm coming towards the end because I know you want to hear from Deacon Tim. This is a wonderful thing. It showed up on my internet feed, my Facebook feed. So I don't know if it's true, but it's attributed to St. Paisius. And it's the value of the curmudgeon. And I've preached on this, right? And here's what St. Paisius is alleged to have said. It is truthy if it's not true. The church needs different people, all, both those who are distinguished by a gentle disposition and those who are severe in temper, bring their ministry to the church. The human body needs different food, both sweet and sour. Even bitter dandelion leaves are needed. After all, every food has its own substances and vitamins. Likewise, the body of the church needs people of any kind. One person makes up for the temper of another. Each of us is obliged to endure not only the peculiarities of the spiritual makeup of our neighbor, but even those weaknesses that exist in him as a person. Unfortunately, some have unreasonable complaints about others. They want everyone to be of the same spiritual makeup as themselves. And when another person differs from them, for example, in a more condescending or harsh character, they immediately come to the conclusion that that person is not spiritual. Isn't that beautiful? Every parish board needs a curmudgeon. So here's the final word before I turn it over to Deacon Tim. And this is how I summarize my talk in a meme. So if it's too much, you have to forgive me because dark humor comes with military service. So, tribal conservative theologians are tempted to see themselves as St. Mark of Ephesus and never as Tertullian. Tribal liberal theologians are tempted to see themselves as St. Gregory of Nyssa and never as Pelagius. And here's how St. Paul puts it. The response: bless those who persecute you. Bless and don't curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with each other. Don't be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be conceited. Repay no one evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all. Don't become overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Just a brief commentary on that. It's especially important in a polarized time that we overcome evil with good, because our discernment of evil is flawed and affected by our perverse identities. And that's it. So now I'm going to bring in my favorite actor, theologian, deacon, as soon as I get my mouse to start working again. And we'll see if he enjoyed his all blue and yellow M&Ms. There he is. All right, Deacon Tim, you're on. They can see you and they can hear you. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Hello. Glory forever.
Amen.
How are you? Thank you. Wow, it's a lot to respond to, isn't it? But first, I should say thank you, because what you're doing here is it's so critically important. You would think it didn't need to be mentioned, but alas, it does. But this whole tribalism thing, and I'm glad you made the distinction that it's not an anthropological term in this case. It is like the face of, I don't know, I don't want to get all apocalyptic, but it is the face of the enemy, I think, in our day. If, as a Christian, with St. Paul and with everything that is implied by, if not stated explicitly by Christ in the Gospels, unity is the essence of, if we see the body of Christ as the truth, then unity is the antithesis of that. And everything right now, the trend is, as you say, is moving more and more toward increasing the disunity, the factionalization, and the inflamed nature of it. It's bad, and it goes across every institution that we can think of. So I think, so again, yeah, thank you for making this such a priority of your work and bringing it to everybody's attention, especially in our church. Just some, I think that, you touched on some things, and I think that we could sort of maybe break down this disunity, this tribalism, into a couple of different subcategories. We got the cultural, yeah. And one thing I would really encourage is that we try as best we can to move beyond terms like conservative and progressive. I don't think they really help anymore. I think they're antiquated, and people try to fit themselves into them, and they're very uncomfortable. And I can explain why I think that's the case. And you mentioned social media. Wow. Eisenhower used to refer to the military-industrial complex as something to be very, very cautious of. Now, he was a 5-star general, president, commander-in-chief, and of all people, he said to be extremely wary of the military-industrial complex. I think we have right now, and I'm not coining this originally, but the media-industrial complex, because this media, and I'm not subscribing to some kind of conspiracy theory. I'm not really like that. I don't think people sit around a board and drool about this, but there is a de facto conspiracy, I think, afoot that monetizes and depends upon our isolation as people and inflames that intentionally, because the more distracted and isolated we are, the more desperate we become for more of this. And there's a price tag, both financial and spiritual, attached to that. And you touched on that. You said something really, really important. Really, a lot of things that were important, but this really struck me. You talked about, the importance of contemplation, prayer, quiet, solitude, as those conditions that help us to see any number of issues in the life of Christ. When you think about what social media does, even though you're in touch with people, you're just spinning your wheels in the mud, and you're going deeper and deeper into your own mishiga, and that is what the prophet, the prophets, the capitalist prophets, depend upon. If you were to break free of that cycle and find that you actually prefer to be spending time quiet, to be praying, to begin to see things in the light of Christ, you're not going to need those things as much. And those profits are going to be threatened. So there's a big, big, powerful force at work that we don't even see. It's just become the air around us, and we have to be so careful. And the other thing I would say, I think, is that this tribalism, to try to engage it on the cultural level, that's important. But I think we have to start much more modestly than that, because I think when you really walk this stuff back, what you find is that it ultimately comes down to a tribe of one, and it's us against the world, even us against God, who's the biggest threat of all. If you don't see God as God really is, God is the most terrifying prospect. It's God who can give you life and take your life away. That sets up a radical other. Talk about others, conservative and progressive, whatever. God can be the most terrifying other. And we have to be so very careful of that. And the only way we can is to live within the liturgical life of the church and to cultivate those things you were just talking about, prayer and meditation and confession and spiritual direction, because discernment is so critical. And we, as an Orthodox church, we have this incredible tradition of spiritual mentorship, fathers and mothers, elders and wisdom figures. I don't know we're doing such a great job of continuing that. But it's critical. And unless we start there, I don't see how we have much of a chance of having an impact on the broader culture. Because I think, to be honest, we all have what I would call the big butt syndrome. You'll say something and you'll say, yes, I see what he's saying. Yes. And then you'll say something else about, something that strikes a nerve, and the big butt will come in. You go, but not me. I don't do that. Or he's saying that, but he's wrong because, for whatever theological, historical fact you want to bring in, that's the big butt. You don't actually really take it in and go, wow, that is the truth of me. You know what I mean? And that's the other thing I would say culturally, is that one thing I think it's kind of simplistic, but what's going on in our culture right now is that our cultural institutions have been largely co-opted or taken over by a philosophical mentality, which is, I would call, the big lie. And the big lie is that there is no such thing as truth. And truth, as we understand it, is love, is God, God's mercy, God's justice joined together. But if you think about that the big lie is that there is no truth, I think you begin to see that that is the case. And it filters down from our educational institutions and all our elite institutions that feed into the water table of our culture. We drink it. It becomes part of us. And the irony is that the claim that there is no truth is the most tyrannical truth claim that there is. It's bizarre, but so we have to, the amount of work that we're going to have to do as individuals and as a church is enormous. And it has to start with this tribe of one, I think. We have to face the fact that we're going to have to develop more and more parallel systems of education to teach these things that aren't being taught. And we have to start developing parallel media programs to reach our culture, gradually, modestly, professionally, but imbued with the signal glory, talk about anthropology, that God became human so that humans could become God. There is nothing in the world that has ever spoken with such power, possibility to people in our history than that. That is salvation. And sin is stepping out of that. And the truth of us is that we are sinners. We do prefer ourselves and our lives to the danger of what God is offering. But yeah, I mean, there's just some feedback. When it comes to the tribalism that you and I spoke about initially when you gave your talk, which was really good, by the way, I enjoyed that a lot. in our world, we tend, as I said, one of the presenters sort of did what I think a lot of people do, which is tend to present Christianity in the United States, for example, or North America or the West, as one thing. So lumping in Catholics, Protestants, Reformed, evangelicals, Orthodox, when in fact there are a lot of different things going on here. You know, we forget that early on Catholics, when they first came here, were extremely marginalized and in some cases actively persecuted. The Orthodox aren't really even on the radar screen here. And yet we have something really unique to bring that no other Christian tradition has really brought to this country yet. So we have an incredible opportunity to address this tribalism you're talking about, except we have our own tribalism. And you alluded to it. This is a big problem. How can we possibly witness to this culture if we're indulging the same dysfunction and dis-ease within ourselves and advertising it as though it's something to be emulated? We're playing right into it.
Yeah, that's a great point, because that's the question that I came up with, because I love your idea about, you know, we need to get ourselves out there more and present this way of being, right, in Christ. We need to do evangelism, basically. But as soon as we start to do that, if our house is in order, the same thing will happen as when, you know, a pastor whose spiritual life isn't in order goes out and tries to change the culture of his parish. It's going to become a reflection of his own psychoses, more than what he really desired was for it to become a part of the will of God. So if we were to, for example, you see people do it with the best of intentions. You know, I'm going to create a website where I invite theologians to come and, you know, present things, right? And what happens? Even if it's offered from that spirit, let's just imagine that there is a theologian who's prayed enough, you know, and is able to offer a reflection. When we read it through the lenses of our polarized Orthodox identities, right? Yeah. So I know people who completely write off anything that's, oh, well, that was on Public Orthodoxy, or, oh, that was on Father Hans's site, right? Just, right. You know, it's that's not good, right? So maybe one of the things that we should demonstrate is how to read with charity, how to hear the other with charity, because that's something that the people aren't. That should be our default, is to hear what they meant to say, right?
Well, it's right. It's such a part, it's at the heart of what we do liturgically. The moment before we receive communion, what do we say? I believe in you, Christ, who come into the world to save sinners, of whom I am first. So we can sit and I'm so pious. I really am the biggest sinner. Look who thinks he's a sinner, you know? But if we take that seriously, we're going to drill down into the truth of that. That's power. Came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am first. That's the truth of who we are. And there's great freedom in that, to be healed and to be an instrument of grace.
Yeah, and so here's where my pride leads me. So it's not just that I'm, you know, the first among sinners, right? I'm of whom I'm first, right? Well, one of the challenges that I have is that it's hard for me. I think it's easy for me to love people, and I'm getting better at hearing what they're saying, right? But what it's hard for me to step out of is just to write everybody off as just being, you know, full of it. So we have to recognize, this is something that it really is a sin. We have to come into the conversations not listening in order to argue, not even listening in order to heal, but listening in order to know and to learn. right? There's a respect for the, we can call it the image of God if you want in that person, that they're worth the dignity of our attention and of our respect. And that's not an easy thing. So if there's a way for us to show how that works, to show how, not just how to say, they're active listening tools where you pick out a couple of things that they say and you parrot it back so that they go deeper, right? Okay, that's fine. That works. But to show how real, the result of two people listening to each other well, how the resulting dialogue takes them into a better place, right? That yes, it establishes a connection between them that we call love, right? That makes the world better just as an ontological fact. But it also makes them wiser, and it makes the thing that they offer to the world, this discernment, better, right? That's what I'd like to see. What often gets presented is one or two people maybe will go off in their study and they'll just work on something. And then they'll just offer it. Here's the wisdom that I came up with as I consulted the fathers, or as I consulted scripture, or as I worked with this person, and you present it, right? I think what would be useful is showing people how the sausage is made, right? And sausage is good, right? What does it look like when theologians are figuring something out in love and loving each other enough to say, here's what I hear you saying. Is that what you said? And then saying, okay, if that's what you said, this is the problem that I have with it. And then, when that's done in love rather than it's just a way to correct or pecking order or something like that, you do get a better product. And I do think that we get that better product. But the thing that we're doing, this love thing, it's a process rather than a product, rather than an end thing. Yeah. And at seminary, that's what we should be doing. The way that we teach and we interact in a class, that's an opportunity for that professor to show how to interact, not just provide knowledge, not just, baby birds coming up to mama bird, here it is, right? And rather, hey, let's discern together.
Yeah.
And I don't see that. I don't see it modeled in movies. I don't see it modeled. Is it modeled in any of our millions of Netflix series? Not really.
Again, it's the media industrial complex, and you can only go so far, but you're selling a product, Yeah. And if you don't sell that product, then you're not in the game.
Yeah. Well, and here's what I think. I think that people do want this, though. I think that they do, that we are built for this. This is what we're made for. And so when we do it, we're healthier, right? We're happier. And so in a capitalist system, that should be part of the market, right? Somebody should be offering it. What is the most popular podcast in America? I mean, by far. Rogan.
Yours?
No, Rogan. Rogan.
Who? Okay.
Yeah, the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah.
What does he do? He sits there for 3 hours with somebody who's at the top of their craft.
Mm-hmm.
And they work out. They discern together for that 2 or 3 hours. And so that's what you're doing. You're hearing the sausage being made. You're hearing what people who, and that's love. What Rogan offers, it's respect, right? Respect grounded in love and in seeing the best out of the person that he's talking to, and then bringing that best out.
I think, because not the least of which is his investment in the whole martial arts thing, but it's a good metaphor because, like a boxer or a fighter, we have to sort of see the truth in there somewhere and pick and bob and weave and duck and get in there, not to knock somebody out, but to touch that part of them that's true, that's protected and heavily defended. But you And because he's really good at that. He's very calm, never really loses his temper. And really, you can always see it right in his eyes that he's following the through line, no matter what thicket it's going through. And he stays with that, stays with the truth of what he's talking about, which is it's a lesson.
Yeah, and it's a gift. And it's a gift that people are responding to.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what I love. And, and so we're getting what we should see, because we are a nation of entrepreneurs, right? And which means that we see what people like and we offer it, right? So I guarantee you that you're seeing more long-form podcasts being offered.
Yeah.
And you'll see more of that kind of conversation being offered in media just generally. And so this is what gets me excited about what you're saying, right? It's not just coming up with, Christian-themed movies, right?
Mm-hmm.
We could do a podcast on that, right? We could talk about, be careful,
Okay.
right? Like Flannery O'Connor
Yes.
said, look, just write good fiction.
Yeah, right.
Don't write
Exactly.
Don't write intentionally Christian fiction, but write good fiction as a Christian. So if we did as a church, if we got our bishops, our people, our parishes to empower this movement, and Ancient Faith Radio, yeah, they're the flagship, right? So support them, give them, because they've hired a full-time content creator, right? And they also have people who are just willing to give content, right? Mm-hmm. Encourage them, right? And Father Andrew Damick, he's a good explainer, right? So he's their full-time content guy.
Oh, he is. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he made that transition this past year. So those are good signals. More, please.
Yeah.
And let's make it so natural that, when I don't know if you were in the class when I taught this, but taught classes on, the need to have small, like Bible study encounters, how to provide that as a mechanism. And it's a mechanism also for this, right? For the developing of relationship, learning how to listen, how to discern together. And it's just an incredibly important part of our formation. So,
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be led by a priest. Oftentimes it shouldn't be led by a priest.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so I even assigned, who's the big church planner? Willow. I forget names. And then what does Dreyer come out with in his book, Live Not by Lies, right? One of the prescriptions for this is, hey, look, do small group stuff. Do small groups are resilient, right? They allow you to counter this, he calls it soft totalitarianism, but counter the effects and the penetration of the media industrial complex, right, is the way you put it. And I think that's absolutely true. So it's not just about creating our own industry, like Ancient Faith Radio on steroids. Mm-hmm. It's also about making that a natural part of our parish life, natural part of our human life.
2,000 years ago.
Yeah. And the dinner table. Boy, the dinner table is another perfect opportunity to witness this, to have the mother and father, talking through something and let the kids see it, and then let the kids kind of play at it to practice. And as they get older, they're not just playing at it, they're actually...
You just nailed it, though. There is a hunger out there. You have made us for yourself, O Lord. Now hearts are restless until they rest in you. That is who we are. We are sinners, true, yeah, but we are made in the image and likeness of God. That's the ultimate truth. And stepping out of that is sin, and that's what we do. Yeah. But it doesn't make us happy.
Right.
It makes us more desperate.
Yeah. So here's what I want. Right now, small group ministry is kind of handicapped by by the COVID and people's fears about being with others, right? And you could do some of it on Zoom. No, but even there, there's something about eating together and talking about things over a meal. I think that's the ideal for it. Yeah. I think we should be ready as soon as COVID opens things back up. This is an opportunity for a new start. And rather than going back into the old rut of just doing parish one way, and at the center of every parish life is the Eucharist and the sacramental life. That's not a rut. That's the offering, right? But parish life, you know, where this is right now. We should be like just becoming pregnant with these things that we're going to go out as soon as the opportunity provides, and just an explosion of entrepreneurial activity within our parishes to evangelize our parishes and evangelize our surrounding communities. This is such a huge opportunity right now.
Yeah, and so there is a blessing in this hardship.
Yeah, you ready?
Potentially.
You ready to get out there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I know you are, and you got so many gifts to bring, and I can't wait to see it. I can't wait to be a part of it. Well, Deacon Tim, I'm always happy when we get together, and other people are too. They love to see you out there on the little screen in this case instead of the big screen.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege.
Yeah, and I'd love to have you on again to talk about, you know, some of the ideas. You know, you write so well, but that's because you think well, right?
Oh.
And so, you know, whatever you're thinking about, I want to bring you on, and so we can track it, run it to ground together.
Sweet.
Yeah. Well, everybody, thanks for hanging in there and listening to a dry academic talk, and then a conversation about that dry academic talk afterwards. That's what academics do, by the way, when they go to conferences. It's just several days of that.
Right.
How's that for an advertisement for academia? Well, everybody, until next time.
Thank you.
Godspeed. All right, I appreciate it.